Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast. In last episode, we explored previous grand bargains that have unfolded throughout history before defining the consistent criteria that all of these grand bargains possess. Due to a lack of incentives amongst the superpowers, I don't see a grand bargain arising in our geopolitical world today. With this being said, in today's episode, I will aim to paint a more complete picture as to why I believe such a grand bargain won't occur anytime soon. To do this, we first need to explore what the superpowers actually want in both the near-term and the long-term future. So let's dive in for today. To begin, we need to be aware of what each superpower involved would want from such a grand bargain. Firstly, when it comes to the United States, in the near term, the United States would want cooperation with Iran to end the war, and perhaps nations getting on board with the United States' strategy of economic statecraft, popularly presented by Michael Every. The United States would also likely want to pursue the Donroe Doctrine uninterrupted. In the long term, these short-term moves would reinforce the United States' long-term strategy to build resiliency, with the ultimate goal the preservation of its position as the world's strongest military and economic power. As for the Chinese, they would want to expand influence in the Indo-Pacific without being constrained. They would want greater recognition of its status as a rising power, both regionally and globally. And they would also want the United States to reduce support for Taiwan. These hopes for China are both near-term and long-term goals, largely due to China's strategic patience. It can allow these advantages to accrue with time. As for the Russians, they would likely want an acceptance of their territorial gains in Ukraine, limits on NATO expansion being formalised by a treaty, and sanctions relief. Russia has always considered itself a geopolitical superpower, and so in the long term, they ultimately want a seat at the superpower table. So now that we've loosely established what each of these nations wants, we can explore if there is any area where they could find potential agreement. Now, most grand bargains in the past saw a win-win scenario emerge. This was built on positive sum interactions. In positive sum interactions, the total payoff received by all players collectively is positive. This often leads to all players making perceived gains. For the superpowers, in any deal, they would want to get at least something that they wanted. When it comes to relations between the United States, Russia, and China, is this possible? Firstly, we'll focus on the United States and China. The most recent event that we can look to on this topic is the Trump-Xi meeting in Beijing. As I discussed at the time, the two nations couldn't actually agree on what they agreed upon. Trump celebrated the deals made that were entirely reversible, while the Chinese rhetoric in the aftermath of the meeting largely revolved around Taiwan. This reinforces that Taiwan is one area where both sides will continue to clash. For the United States, the status of Taiwan is a tool through which it can keep China occupied. In a big picture view, even if the two sides agreed to win-win relationships in the energy sector, for example, in semiconductors or in space, the opposite could occur. In each of these areas where competition can very easily move into conflict, this is a potential trigger point that would erode the likelihood of a maintained win-win relationship between the United States and China. As for the United States and Russia now, the US and Russia have attempted to negotiate during Trump's presidency, with one of the most notable occurrences being the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska. But there have also been many visits to Russia by Trump officials, which has ultimately not led to a bilateral deal or any deal in Ukraine. In the last week, we saw Zelensky's open letter to Putin calling for an end to the war. Putin rejected this letter, calling it rude and pushing for the Russians to, quote, keep on working, brothers. This statement came at the end of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, which was attacked by Ukrainian drones. This statement, "Keep on working, brothers," has historical context. It was a statement made by a police lieutenant from Dagestan who was attacked by 5 militants, kidnapped and shot in July of 2016. His murder was recorded, and the militants wanted him to appear on camera to tell other police officers to quit and to stop fighting. Instead, Nurmagomedov, who was the police officer, said, quote, "Keep on working, brothers." Again, this highlights my recent comments that both Russia and Ukraine believe time is on their side, and it implies that the slow, grinding war of attrition will continue until a major shift occurs. For the United States and Russia, there's been little progress in negotiating a potential peace for Ukraine, but there has also been little positivity in bilateral relations improving between the two. Finally, we'll explore Russia and China. Now, the friendship without limits is a phrase that was made famous by Russia and China in their 2022 joint declaration. Russia and China are incentivized to cooperate because both want a greater piece of the geopolitical world pie, typically through greater representation in a multipolar world order. The United States was the nation that benefited from its period of unipolarity after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And today, with the United States showing some signs of decline, there is an opportunity for nations to pick up some moving pieces in this geopolitical world. As a result of this period currently experiencing some dramatic geopolitical changes, the Russians and the Chinese remain on the same page when it comes to their long-term goals. These issues, specifically involving the United States, paint a picture that a deal that would live up to the name of a grand bargain is highly unlikely. A Westphalian-style full global settlement would be unachievable, and even a trilateral deal between the three nations would be difficult, because any bilateral deals involving the United States are clearly a struggle to establish. Any partial areas of cooperation also don't move the needle enough to limit superpower competition. But one key question that remains is whether the United States would give up a part of its superpower strength to maintain or strengthen another. And if they did, what could this world potentially look like? It's this that we'll discuss in next episode. In recent negotiations between the United States and Russia and China individually, there has been little positive progress. This doesn't paint the picture of an environment where trust and cooperation on a grand scale are likely. But despite this, next time we will explore this hypothetical environment where a grand bargain does occur, so we can demonstrate just how unlikely it is. Keep an eye out for that discussion that will be released on Tuesday. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on the podcast platform of your choice. I've been Dylan, and I'll talk to you next time.